Hello there, chemistry friends. So this video is going to be about how to prep your lab notebook. So up until this point in your science career, you probably have been given a worksheet and you do what the worksheet tells you, and you fill it in, and then it asks you questions, and then you answer the questions based off of your lab. Gone are the days of those worksheets in chemistry. It is your responsibility to read the pre-lab and prep your lab notebook for that lab. So like I do every year, I'm going to walk you through how to prep your lab notebook. Okay. And since we're not doing paper pencil, you can do your lab prep on a piece of paper, but there are slides that you're going to have to take a picture of your lab prep and post them on there. Okay. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about are the headings. Okay. All of these headings that I'm going to talk about must be done prior to you performing the lab. So before you, for this year, before you even step foot into the lab, your lab notebook has to have the following things, okay? The first one is the title. So this is sometimes given to you with your lab prep handout. If it's not, you have to create one, and we'll talk about what that looks like. Oh, I guess I have to click. Okay. The second thing is the purpose. This statement tells your reader of your lab what you plan on doing and why you plan on doing it. This statement should always start with the following phrase. The purpose of this lab is whatever the purpose is, okay? The purpose, there's only two sections in an entire lab report that have to be in complete sentences. The purpose is one, and the conclusion is the last one, okay? So the purpose has to be in complete sentences. That's number two. Number three are the concepts, okay? This section of your lab report draws on what you learned in class, so notes, to what you are doing in lab. And this can simply be a bullet point list of what the crossover is. This section really helps you understand, like, okay, if I'm doing this lab, what have I already learned that's helping me with the lab? And then the next thing that you have to have is a procedure. So your step-by-step process that you plan on doing in order to get data, right? So you have to do something in order for something to happen. So what is the process in which you are doing that? And then lastly, before you come into the lab, you have to have had created a data table. The data table there's no, criteria for the data table as long as you are collecting the data. So whatever makes sense to you is what you can create your data table as. The only requirement is that you have to be able to collect all necessary data. So those are all the things that you have to have done prior to walking into lab. So let's look at an example. So as you follow along, and you are going to be doing the same thing in your lab notebook. So everybody's pre-lab should all look the same because you're just going to copy what I'm doing. Okay, so what lab we are doing, it's called a flame test lab. Okay, and in this lab, I'm just going to read. It says, when an atom is heated, you have already learned that electrons absorb energy in indefinite amounts, okay? And as they cool, they emit energy. And in that energy, since some of those energies fall on the color scale that we can see, you'll be able to actually see a color. When heated, each element emits a characteristic pattern of light energy, which we've already talked about in lecture, that is useful for identifying that element. So if anybody's seen fireworks before, what I'm talking about with your flame test lab is exactly what happens during fireworks. And we're going to look a little bit more into that later in the week. This pattern is caused by electrons jumping and then falling back down, and the amount of energy that's released is known as photons. In this lab, you will determine the flame colors generated by several salts, nitrate salts. Just think about it as like sodium chloride. Don't think about it anything crazy. And then to attempt to identify two salts, so I said chloride salts, but they're basically unknown, by heating them in the flame. So the purpose of this lab is to observe the colors emitted by various metal ions, which are the elements on the left side of the periodic table, and to identify unknown salts by the color of their flames. So with those two things, I should be able to create a purpose and concepts, and I do. So you'll see here that I have written, so currently I have my title, which I need, and I always need a date, okay? If I don't have a date, I can't prove that at the day that I'm performing the lab. And then my purpose is stated here. It says, the purpose of this lab is to observe the colors emitted by various metal ions to identify unknown salts by the color of their flames. So everybody should have this as their purpose. So it's very clear. Purpose. The purpose of this lab is, and you have to finish. Your purpose can be more than one sentence. And the second thing I have here is concepts. So the two concepts that we have discussed in class that we are looking at in this lab are energy transitions and Bohr models, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we do data analysis. Okay, the second part, so this is the lab handout again. You'll notice that I gave the materials. However, there's no section in your lab notebook where you have to provide materials. You can if you want to, but I'm not requiring it. And then you'll notice I was nice and gave a little bit of a procedure. So it's up to you. You can either copy it word for word, or you can change it to where it makes sense to you. So basically what we're gonna do is light a Bunsen burner. So fire, our fire source. We're gonna take a wooden splint, put it in the fire. That wooden splint has been soaking in the metal ions. So when I stick it into the fire, it's going to emit a different color. And then I'm gonna record that color, and I'm gonna repeat that same process for each salt. So with that being said, I wrote my procedure as follows. So here you can see I have the original purpose and concepts that I just discussed, okay? And then my procedure is my next thing. So my procedure is light the Bunsen burner, right? I can't have fire if I don't light it. So I'm gonna light the Bunsen burner. I'm gonna put the pre-soaked wooden splints into the flame. I'm gonna be careful not to burn the wood, because if I'm burning the wood, I'm not burning the metal. And then I'm gonna place splint in the water. Why? Because it's on fire and I don't wanna burn down the spool. So I'm gonna place my wooden splint into the beaker. And then I'm gonna repeat steps 1 through 3 for all substances. And then I'm gonna record my results in my data table. So that's the procedure that you should have written for this lab. Okay, and then the last thing that you have to have prior to walking into the lab, before you perform the lab, is your data table. So what data are you collecting? So based off of my procedure, I'm observing flame color, right? Since I'm observing flame color, I need a table that is empty for me to collect flame color. And you'll notice that I have put all of the metal ions that we're testing here. So we're testing barium, copper, iron, potassium, sodium, strontium. And then you're gonna have two unknowns, an unknown A and an unknown B. And your job is to figure out what unknown A and unknown B are based off of the ones that you do know. Okay, so that's all you need prior to walking into the lab. So let's talk about what happens after we perform the lab. So after we perform the lab, you're gonna have data analysis. Okay, so this is where you're looking at the data and explaining what it means, and this should relate back to your purpose. The data analysis does not have to be in complete sentences. So for example, for this lab, your data analysis is gonna look something like this. Unknown A is salt or metal blank because, and using your data, you're going to explain how you know that, okay? And that's the data analysis. And then the last piece is conclusion, okay? And your conclusion has to be in complete sentences, and it looks the same every single time, okay? The conclusion summarizes what your data is in addition to how you achieved the purpose, okay? You also need to make sure that you talk about 2 possible sources of error, and this is for every lab. And your conclusion should have these 3 sentence stems in it every single time. So I always want to restate the purpose. So I'm going to say the purpose of this lab was, and you can literally copy paste whatever your purpose was in the beginning of the lab. And then you need to say, I achieved this by, so how did you achieve this the purpose of the lab. How did you observe colors? And most of the time, I achieve this by is where you're going to get multiple sentences for your conclusion. And then the last thing that you need to have in your conclusion is you say, two possible sources of error are, and then you say what the possible sources of error are. And we need to remember that we can't say human error, because what is the human error? You can say human error, but you have to be very specific about what that human error is. Okay? And we'll talk about that once we perform the lab. So great. That's how you prep your lab notebook. Thank you.